our way of reckoning, the Greeks were deeply sexist. Women, in their view, were responsible for all that is bad in the world. It was a woman, you may recall, called Pandora, the name means all gifted, who, because of her insatiable curiosity, opened the jar which contained all the evils in the world, sickness, hard work, and so on, leaving only hope inside. In other words, Pandora bears a strong family resemblance to biblical Eve. It wasn't just Greek myths that were sexist. Greek scientists weren't any better. The greatest of them believed that women were biologically inferior to men. In his treatise called Generation of Animals, Aristotle defined a woman as an infertile male. She is infertile, he explained, because of a kind of inadequacy, adunamia, being unable to produce semen. He thought that the menses was failed sperm that hadn't coagulated properly. As a Greek woman, you might well have been stuck in a rut. There were very few outlets for female talent. Your chances of becoming a creative artist or an intellectual were pretty much nil. You might have become a poetess. We hear of several poetesses, the most notable of whom is Sappho, but only fragments of their work have survived, which in itself seems to tell us a lot about the prejudices of largely male readers.
Yep.
And there were other drawbacks to being a woman.
Really?
Skeletal evidence indicates that you would have predeceased Greek men by about 5 to 10 years. This was partly due to the early age at which you became pregnant and entered childbirth, and partly due to the small interval between your successive pregnancies. If you haven't guessed it already, I should tell you that there's going to be a lot of social pressure upon you to get married, and once married, to become pregnant ASAP. I've mentioned already Medea's comment in Euripides' play of that name, "I'd rather go into battle 3 times than give birth once." Though that comment comes from the pen of a man, I bet there were lots of women who said to their husbands, "You think battle is dangerous and painful? Just you try giving birth."
No shit.
Incidentally, some scholars used to argue that Euripides was a misogynist on the grounds that he portrayed some pretty frightening women in his plays. Women like Medea, who murders her children, Phaedra, who falsely accuses her stepson of raping her, and so on. I happen to think the very opposite was the case. I think he was horrified, not so much by women as by the horrific things they could do when placed under intolerable pressure by men, like killing their children if their ex-husbands try to take them from them, which is what Medea does. Unless you choose to cut off all ties with your family, you'll be under the control of a male, either your father, your husband, your eldest brother, or your guardian. Your subjugation to your husband would have been made more acute by the fact that there was typically a large discrepancy between your age and his. The poet Hesiod, who was composing in the 7th century BC, recommended that a man should be not much under 30 and a girl in her 5th year past puberty. That's to say, perhaps around 17. As a moderately prosperous wife, you would have spent most of your time in the home. Andromache, in Euripides' play The Trojan Women, states, "There is one prime source of scandal for a woman when she doesn't stay at home." But before we get too down on the Greeks, we need to put aside our own preconceptions, our own sensibility, and our own sense of cultural evolution, as I argued in our discussion on slavery. Only then can we come some way to understanding what it was like to be a Greek woman. I don't expect anyone at the end of this lecture to be thinking, "Ooh, I do wish I'd been a Greek woman. They had so much fun." But I do hope to contextualize their lot in a way that makes it seem that if you had been a woman living in ancient Greece and thinking as an ancient Greek woman, then your life would not have seemed as bad as it does from our 21st century perspective. And as with slaves, we shall discover that Greek women were not an undifferentiated mass. There were real choices that women could make, choices that enabled them to lead radically different lives from the majority of their kind. So let's imagine you're a young Greek girl. Pretty much all your life, you've been stuck at home, strictly supervised, until the day you get married. As we saw in the lecture about growing up Greek, you probably wouldn't have received any formal education. There's no dating scene. Unsupervised premarital contact between a well-brought-up boy and girl is out of the question. Even a premarital peck on the cheek is probably forbidden, except, perhaps, when you become betrothed. Even so, extramarital sex must have occurred from time to time, though teenage pregnancies are likely to have been far fewer than they are in our society. So when you reach the age of about 14, your parents start looking for a husband for you if they haven't had their eye on a suitable candidate for some time. Arranged marriages were the norm in Greek society, as no doubt in most ancient societies, and as indeed they are in many modern societies as well. There's a wonderful discussion in Xenophon between a fictional character called Ischomachus and his wife, in which Ischomachus tells her how it was they came to get hitched up together. It wasn't just because I wanted someone beside me in bed at night, he tells her. Your parents were looking for a suitable son-in-law, and I was looking for a suitable wife. I chose you, and they chose me from a host of possibilities. How romantic. So, what are the criteria that your parents will be thinking of when they go about choosing a husband for you? Well, first and foremost, they want a man with wealth and social status, of course. Marriage served two principal goals, both for your family and for your husband's family. These were, one, to produce offspring, and two, to increase the family's wealth. Your parents would have to provide you with a dowry, because without a dowry you risked ending your life unwed and barren, as Oedipus lamented, thinking of his girls. The dowry was intended to reimburse your husband for supporting you. If he divorced you, and we've no idea what the divorce rate was in Greece, but divorce certainly occurred, then he had to return it in full, either to your father, or if your father had died, to whoever now became your legal guardian, perhaps your eldest brother. Your dowry, in other words, was a kind of insurance policy. It guaranteed that as a divorcee, you would not be financially destitute. And, of course, it also acted as a disincentive to divorce. You may be betrothed for months, if not years. Eventually, however, it's the day of your wedding. It's almost certainly the summer. On the day of your wedding, you take a ritual bath from a special vase known as a eutrophorus, which marks your rite of passage from unmarried to married. You then sit down to a banquet in your father's house or the house of your legal guardian. All your relatives and friends are present, as are the relatives and friends of your bridegroom. You're veiled and you sit apart from your bridegroom. Then, when it starts to get dark, the feasting ends and your bridegroom conveys you, still veiled, in a wagon to your new home. On arrival at his house, both of you are showered with nuts and dried figs, the Greek equivalent of confetti, symbolic of the prosperity and fertility that it is hoped will attend your marriage. What happened next is a complete mystery. There was no state official or priest waiting to conduct the marriage ceremony. We know of no standard form of words that was equivalent to an exchange of vows. We don't even know whether anyone pronounced you husband and wife. But if some form of words were spoken, it was surely now. And then your husband conducts you to the bridal chamber, and once inside, you finally remove your veil. The door to the chamber is now closed. Outside the chamber, relatives sing a hymn called an epithalamion, from thalamos, meaning inner room or bedroom. The rest is silence. Or perhaps the opposite. A late source tells us that the macabre purpose of the hymn was to muffle the cries of the bride as she underwent the painful ordeal of penetration. It's clear that marriage created a much more violent disruption in your life as a woman than it did in the life of a man. Your husband, as we've seen, is likely to have been considerably older than you. He's probably had plenty of sexual experience as well. The violence of the disruption you experienced is brilliantly conveyed by the anonymous 7th century poem known as the Hymn to Demeter, which describes the abduction of Persephone, a daughter of Demeter, who was the goddess of the corn, by Hades, the grim god of the underworld. Persephone is innocently plucking flowers in a meadow when she is snatched away to become the bride of an aged and forbidding stranger whom she has never seen before. In real life too, the bride was often taken from her family when she was scarcely past playing with her dolls. I'm reminded of a famous song that the British-born Gracie Fields used to sing. Walter, Walter, take me to the altar, which ends with a killer line, marry me, make all my nightmares come true.
Oh, wow.
Well, there was no altar involved, but the nightmares may well have been just as real for some Greek brides, wrested from childhood and forced to submit to their husbands.
Damn.
So you're married. What next? Well, you immediately take on a number of responsibilities, chief of which is to produce a male heir, tout sweet, to ensure that the family line does not die out. Should you fail to become pregnant, you will either be regarded with grave suspicion, or it will be assumed, more benignly, that there's something wrong with you. No blame will be attached to your husband. It was always the woman who was to blame for the failure to become pregnant. So you're under intense pressure to conceive from the word go, so to speak. Not surprisingly, therefore, concerns about infertility feature prominently in the miraculous cures that are recorded at the healing sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus in the northeast Peloponnese. We've already met Ithmonike in the first lecture, who was infertile and went to Epidaurus to be made pregnant.
Yeah.
Another reads as follows. Agamede from Chios. She slept in the sanctuary in order to have children, and she had a dream. A snake seemed to lie on her belly, and as a result, she produced 5 children. Snakes were sacred to Asclepius. We'll be talking about his healing powers in a later lecture. Well, lucky old Agamede. Let's hope that guaranteed her a bit of respect when she returned to Chios. I find myself wondering what compulsion brought her all the way to Epidaurus, a considerable distance across the Aegean. Intolerable pressure from her husband, a sense of personal worthlessness, or that most human instinct, a basic yearning for a child.
Wah, wah.
As a married woman, you're also in charge of the running of the household. If you're well-bred, you don't have to do any housework yourself. That's all done by the slaves. But it's still your job to supervise those slaves and to see that they don't get up to any mischief. And finally, it would be you and your sisters-in-law and so on who would take the major part in preparing a corpse for burial, as women do to this day in Mediterranean countries. Just as had been the case when you were an unmarried girl, so now you would rarely have appeared in public, and if you do go out, you'll wear your veil. Pericles notoriously observed, "The highest glory for a woman is to be spoken of neither in praise nor in blame." In other words, you're expected to be socially invisible. You're expected not only to stay at home, but also to keep yourself away from the gaze of men. The only men you had regular contact with were your close relatives. Most of the time, you'll be in the women's quarters, the Gunakaion, which is situated in the most remote and sheltered part of the house, or perhaps upstairs. Whenever your husband invites some of his pals over for a drink, you won't be present. There was a special part of the house designated for him and his pals too, known as the andron. And all this, of course, is if your family is well-to-do. You'll have to spend long hours in the company of your female slaves and your children. We don't actually know whether Athenians or other Greeks would have gone out much with their wives and daughters, or would they typically have strolled together in downtown Athens, arm in arm, for instance. We never hear of it, though that obviously doesn't mean that they didn't do it. There were, however, some occasions when you were allowed to appear in public. To start with, you were allowed to attend festivals. There were even a few festivals, such as the Thesmophoria, which was held in honor of Demeter in the fall, which only women could attend.
Wow.
And you could also attend funerals. In the novels of Jane Austen, young girls spend much of their time eagerly awaiting the next ball. As a young Athenian girl, you'd probably spend much of your time eagerly awaiting the death of Uncle Meletus or Aunt Melpomene. In fact, a funeral was one of the few occasions when you might catch the eye of a potential lover, as we learn from the speechwriter Lysias. The husband, a man called Eratosthenes, for whom Lysias wrote the speech, is facing a charge of homicide for having killed his wife's lover. He claims, however, that he killed the man in flagrante delicto. The prosecution claimed the killing was premeditated. Anyway, it emerges that his wife's adulterer first set eyes on her at a funeral. He subsequently suborned one of her slaves, who then acted as a go-between.
Scandalous.
The speech known as In Prosecution of Eratosthenes provides us with a wonderful insight into daily life. It demonstrates how even in the most straight-laced societies, and even when the penalties for violating the conventions are extreme, there will always be people who find ways to break the mold, even at the risk of their own lives.
Oh, shit.
And finally, in addition to festivals and funerals, you were expected to make periodic visits to the cemetery to perform cult, what the Greeks called the customary practices on behalf of your dead relatives, attending their tombs and depositing food and drink there. So, was this the best, so to speak, that life had to offer, being either someone's daughter or someone's wife without any independent identity of your own? Well, certainly this seems to have been how the majority of well-bred Athenian women lived, and it had its compensations. It gave you security, status, respect, material comfort, and family ties. Not a bad package. However, it came with a certain amount of boredom, at least from our perspective. It was certainly better than being what used to be called a spinster, that's to say an unmarried woman, a position with low social status in Greek society and, one suspects, little gratification. Very likely, a spinster would end up as a kind of servant in the family of some male relative. Of course, if you happened to be poor, there would be no slave to do the shopping and other tasks, such as drawing water from the nearest well, so you'd inevitably enjoy more freedom, the freedom at least to do manual labor.
Yeah.
Widows, too, would not be constrained in the same way that unmarried girls and married women were. But is that the total picture? What about women who chose, for whatever reason, not to get married? What was the ancient Greek equivalent of the singles scene in Sex and the City? Or you might think that's a bridge too far, making any comparison between contemporary New York and ancient Greece. The fact is, however, that we do have portraits of two single women in earliest Greek literature. Calypso and Circe in the Odyssey are both single and 30-something, perhaps even 40-something in Circe's case. They're clearly looking for men to hang out with.
Yeah.
We should note, however, that these were goddesses, not mortal Greek women.
All women are
And the
goddesses.
Odyssey provides us with a unique picture. We don't meet anyone remotely resembling a Calypso or a Circe in any other literary source. And it's inconceivable that there was a singles scene in ancient Greece.
Yeah, baby.
What we do encounter, however, in real life are hetairae, or female companions. Though the term is sometimes inaccurately translated as prostitutes, many hetairae were highly accomplished. They were the only women who were permitted to take their place beside men at symposia or drinking parties. The most famous hetaira of all was Aspasia, the mistress of the powerful Athenian statesman Pericles.
Yeah, baby.
Aspasia was fully able to hold her own conversationally in the company of the leading luminaries of her day.
Yeah.
Educated, politically informed, personable, and no doubt very attractive as well, she epitomizes all that any and every Greek woman might have been, if only she had been allowed to fulfill her potential.
Well, why does she have to be attractive as well?
We don't know anything about the circumstances that might have induced you to decide to become a hetaira, but it's possible that you would have opted to take this career path, because it enabled you to achieve your potential in ways you could not have done if you'd got married, and B, because you craved a life of independence. But we've no idea what percentage of the population chose this path, though it's likely to have been relatively small.
Well, dude, you're even sexist in your own freaking talk about it. Oh, it's bullshit.
And of course, you would also have had to deal with some opprobrium.
You're not very attractive.
Be part of the reason why a lot of hetairae moved away from their native cities to pursue their careers, like Aspasia herself, to avoid being made to feel ashamed and to avoid becoming outcast.
Exactly.
As foreigners in the city where they worked, they would also have become more exotic and therefore able to charge higher fees. Other options available to you outside the home included being a priestess or being a midwife, but we've no idea what percentage of the population chose this path, though it's not necessarily much independence and there weren't many positions available. As a midwife, by contrast, you would have had not only independence but also authority, since midwives, not physicians, controlled the birthing process. Probably, however, only women beyond childbearing years, perhaps widows primarily, would have been regarded as eligible for this job. By contrast to the situation elsewhere in the Greek world, Spartan women enjoyed a measure of independence that was exceptional, if not unique. As a Spartan girl, you would have undergone an intense physical training program which included running, discus and javelin throwing, and wrestling. Its objective was to ensure that you would become a fit breeder of Spartan babies. As a Spartan wife, you could be loaned, so to speak, to an interested party with the agreement of your husband, presumably to maximize upon your fecundity, especially if your husband happened to be elderly or infirm. Sparta had to deal with a falling birth rate. As a woman, you were permitted to own property. This was certainly not the case in Athens. You might even be celebrated for your wisdom. We have examples of female wisdom preserved in Plutarch's sayings of Spartan women, though we should not assume that they are all authentic.
Okay.
The most famous is the laconic farewell from a Spartan mother to her son who was departing for war. With it or on it. The it is his shield. What she meant was that he should either return home bearing his shield, because to throw it away when retreating was a disgrace, or on it if he was killed. Whether historical or apocryphal, this saying and many others like it suggest that Spartan mothers played a leading role in reinforcing the Spartan value system, perhaps at the cost of their role as mothers.
Damn.
In conclusion, what can we say about the relationship between the sexes overall? There's much, of course, to lament and to object to. As a female, your life expectancy was lower than that of males, your opportunities for receiving an education severely curtailed, and your job prospects very limited. The connection between education and longevity has recently been scientifically demonstrated. While I was working on this lecture, I read an article in the leading British medical journal known as The Lancet by Christopher Murray, an epidemiologist at the University of Washington. His article indicated that women who are educated and who live in countries where they have opportunities of fulfilling their potential actually live longer.
Yeah, baby.
Not surprising. In addition, many Greek men lorded it over their wives in a way that would be, I would like to say, largely unthinkable in the West today.
Yep.
However, we should not assume that A, men and women did not achieve intimacy, or that B, men invariably held the upper hand. Odysseus in the Odyssey is wholly dependent on the services and resourcefulness of a group of very strong-willed and independent women who are more than a match for their male counterparts. His wife Penelope, for a start, fends off no fewer than 108 suitors over a period of 20 years to keep the household and her chastity intact, and in the end tricks Odysseus into revealing his identity to her. Odysseus, it is who actually provides us with the best definition of what marriage meant in the Greek world, notwithstanding the fact that he has been flagrantly unfaithful to his wife. He says, "No finer, greater gift in the world than that, when man and woman possess their home together, two minds, two hearts that work as one, despair to their enemies, a joy to all their friends, their own best claim to glory." Greek drama too suggests that Greek women were anything but a pushover. The women we encounter in Greek drama, Clytemnestra, Antigone, Jocasta, Medea, Phaedra, Lysistrata, are among the most powerful in any theatrical tradition the world over. And then there are the goddesses. You wouldn't want to mess with them, not with Hera or Athena or Artemis or Aphrodite. And though again they're only fictionalized, so to speak, the inspiration for them had to come from somewhere. It must have come from real life. Writing some 800 years after Homer, Plutarch, in a treatise entitled Advice on Marriage, extolled the virtues of homophrosyne or homonoia, roughly translatable as like-mindedness, which he, and no doubt many decent Greeks, believed to be the mark of an ideal marriage. Ordinary men and women don't invariably achieve that state of bliss with each other, but the fact that some Greeks did yearn for the perfect union suggests that in this respect they weren't much different from us. And there's another respect in which the Greeks were